so let's get started with our braid. Now, the thing I love the most about making scarves with braids is you can find a lot of really, really cool braids with dye jobs as far as just how it's dyed, obviously. But the reason why this tends to be the easiest is if you've watched a video about how commercial top is made, you will see that it actually comes off in a sheet before it comes off in this roving bit. So you can actually spread this out almost back into its sheet form. So these make really, really cool cobweb scarves. So I think with this fiber type, I am going to go ahead and make this into a cobweb scarf. Let's just lay this out. Now, one of the things about doing it with a braid is you will be a little bit limited because there's only so much fiber width-wise that you can spread this out. So it's basically however dense your roving is determines the width of your scarf if you don't want it to get too thin. So even some of these areas, there's already some really big holes. So I'm actually going to pull some of this over and maybe overlap it a little bit so that it adds a little bit of strength to those areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to continually be spreading this out all the way down. And you'll just keep doing this until you get to a scarf shape that you really, that you're satisfied with. So again, you see this gaping hole right here. Now, something I might do in this case is I might just take a little bit of fiber off the end. Since this is, I've got a little bit of an extra long chunk in here, let's just take this whole piece off and we'll just use that for patching. This braid is a little bit felted because it's been sitting in my fiber trunk for a while. I've been hoarding it because I like the colorway so much. So then with this hole, yeah, because that's a pretty big hole right in there. And I'm not going to want, I don't want a hole that big because it's going to be really weak in that area. The biggest thing about felting cobweb scarves is while the holes usually end up wherever they end up, you can plan them a little bit, but wherever the fiber is thin, that's where your holes are going to be. So you will still have a hole in here, but I'm just going to bridge the gap a little bit, and I might even put a few fibers across this way just to lock it in a little bit. So I'm going to just keep spreading this out, and I will come back when I'm at a point where I'm happy with it. Okay, so I've laid out my braid kind of where I want everything. So you can see I wasn't sure what I was planning on using this for when I broke it apart, so my scarf is a little bit shorter. But that's okay, it'll still be a fairly decent length scarf, more of a one time around the neck probably. But at this point I'm just going to lay my mesh over top. And now at this point I'm going to go ahead and start soaking this down. Now you may need to adjust your nozzle. I don't like to put it on a super, super fine mist. I like to have enough water coming out so that it gets wet fairly fast and you'll be able to feel it. So I should be able to press down, and this is still still pretty dry, so I'm going to keep adjusting just a little bit here. There we go. And I've seen people use other methods where they'll sprinkle it with like a few holes in the bottom of a water jug. I feel like this way I have a little bit more control of where everything goes. Let's just check and see where we're at here. That's feeling pretty good. Now, here, this, as far as your edges go, this is part of the reason why I gave you some extra space with the mesh, because if you wanted to have these edges as a really, like, nice and straight, you can just fold this over and be able to just cut the edges real clean like this. So I don't really want to do that on this one just because I like the raw edges. But if you wanted really straight, clean edges, that's what you would do with that. Yeah, you see, you get plenty of suds in there if you put this open afterwards too. And generally when I check to see how wet it is, I don't slide everything because you can shift your fiber around too much. With the braid it's not as big of a deal, but when we do the other two methods that will be a little bit of a bigger deal. Okay, so the next type that we're going to look at is raw, or not raw fleece, but just straight up unprocessed. So it should be washed at this point if you're using wool that has lanolin in it. But in this case, I'm going to use some alpaca. So alpaca is kind of nice because even when you're felting, it has kind of the same properties as if you were to knit or crochet with it. So alpaca is known for having a really nice drape. So it is harder to get a solid scarf with this, but if you were to get a solid scarf, not a cobweb scarf, with all of these, you're basically going to want to layer a lot. So I'm actually just going to start from one end here. And it helps if you cloud your fiber a little bit beforehand. And we're just going to start laying it out. So I'm going to use a combination of some gray, and I have some white down here as well. And I think what I want to do is I want to give it a little bit of like a watercolor effect. So how I'm going to do that, I'm just going to keep fluffing and layering. Now the biggest thing you have to remember is that as this compresses, it's going to interlock. So you want to have a lot of things overlaying, overlapping, because that's going to give your scarf the strength. So to give myself kind of a little bit of a watercolor effect, you want to make sure your fiber is nice and clouded, and you're going to just feather it over top a little bit. And keep. So we'll be doing another cobweb scarf with this one, just because they're gorgeous and they're really easy with clouded fiber like this. And the fun part, if you use alpaca and stuff, or if you have something that when you wash it you get the lock structures, as you felt, you'll still be able to see some of those natural lock structures in there. Okay, so now we've laid out all of the alpaca, and something that is a little different from the braid is it's a lot poofier. And that's characteristic of alpaca. And the thing about alpaca, like, just be careful about the different types of fibers that you use, guys, because felt fiber like this, alpaca, even though it's soft, actually doesn't felt as well as even some medium wools. But like, it will still felt, it might just take a little bit longer. So I might put this in my dryer a little bit longer than I would, say, the braid. But at this point, so just don't use anything like Leicester long wool. If you're going to use nothing but Leicester long wool for the entire thing, you're going to be there for a long time. To be perfectly honest, I don't know if it really would felt all the way to a point where it wouldn't pull apart. It might at some point, but save yourself the headache, and just be careful what kind of fiber you use. So I'm going to go ahead and put this over. I'm trying not to shift this too much because this one, if I shift this too much, all the fiber is going to rearrange, and I really like the layout that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same for this, and I'm going to start soaking this down. You can see the fibers even move here. Now, something different about the alpaca than with the braid is because it's so poofy, it's going to take a little bit longer to soak this one down, and you'll want to go ahead and press down as you soak it down. And again, as I mentioned previously, when you press the mesh down, press it. You don't want to like try to spread it, because if you do that, you're going to rearrange some of this stuff as you go. And we will do embellishments on the next scarf, so keep an eye on that one. Oh, and then I have a little itty bitty piece of veggie matter in here. Some people say that, oh, if you have fiber that's dirty or if it's bad, just use it for felting. That's not true, because whatever you are felting, it gets trapped in it, and once it's trapped in it, it doesn't come out. So I personally like to work with cleaner fiber when I'm felting than even when I'm spinning, because when I'm spinning, I can sit there and I can pick it out as I go along. With felting, it all just gets trapped underneath all of the fibers. Okay, so at this point I have already soaked down all of the alpaca, and you can see there's still some edges here that are a little poofy, and part of that is just because it's alpaca and it doesn't want to soak the fiber in all the way. But I'm going to show you really quick how I do more of a clean edge scarf. So what I'm going to go and do is I'm just going to start on the edges. This is why we have the 14 inches of tulle or nylon mesh instead of just the 12. So we can come in and we can actually just fold this over. And I want to make sure that I get my fiber pushed all the way into that edge. So I'm using kind of my bubble wrap as a guide to keep it straight. So I have like maybe two rows of bubbles here. I'm going to come in and I'm going to do this all around the whole edge of the scarf. And I'm using my bottom layer of nylon to come up and fold over, and then I'll take this top layer and just lay it back over top. So I'm going to go ahead and do that around the whole edge of the scarf. So I've gone all the way around the edges of the scarf, and I already did the one end. I'm just going to show you really quick with the ends. I've got the two flaps folded in, and then it might be hard to see, but I've got this area here that I kind of just fold in, but you want to make sure that these sides that are folded in aren't just taking some of the fiber and folding it over. So I'm going to try to square this off a little bit, and I just pull my fiber around where spots are thin. I'm going to try and square this off. Okay, we're going to lay out our last scarf, and this time I'm going to use bats. This is honestly probably my favorite way of doing this. You have so much freedom. It's really easy to do a cobweb scarf with a bat, or you can turn around and you can do a solid scarf with it, because it's all your fibers are already just kind of placed together and aligned. And I'll show you the best way to get a solid scarf, but also with this one we're going to add some embellishments. So I have some locks here that I want to use as tassels on either end. So I've got some really nice and white Cotswold locks, and then I've got these really pretty kind of silvery gray Lincoln locks. This is a Lincoln lamb fleece. This is so soft. But I thought that using a mixture of both of those locks would look really nice. And then there's already some little embellishments in the bat, some little strings and whatnot, but I'm also going to take just some mohair and I'm going to just kind of make some designs with it on it as well. So because I want this scarf to be a little bit more solid, I'm going to set aside more of my color and decorative stuff. I'm going to set that off to the side and do my base first. So the best way to get a nice solid scarf is to do a crisscross with your fibers. So what I would do with this, I'm just going to take my base white and tear it into some strips here. Now when you're doing a full scarf, it's going to be a lot thicker. So I try to work in from the sides just a little bit, just because otherwise it gets really hard to manage. And then I'm not going to start all the way at the end because I want some room for my locks as well. So I'm just going to start and just keep pulling sections, making sure I'm overlapping a little bit here and there. And this may get staticky. And I'm not going to, so I'm going to do this part first. I'm just going to lay one layer all the way across. And once I've got this layer, then I'm going to actually come back right at the beginning and I'm going to take some long sections and cross it perpendicular. And this really just kind of locks everything in, locks everything together. You get a nice sturdy scarf this way. And I'm not doing a whole lot on the ends just at this moment, but when I add the locks in, when I add the locks in, I'm going to actually sandwich them in between. So once I get that far, we will go from there. This gets really staticky, so sometimes I just spritz a little bit so that it's not so sticky to my hands everywhere. Okay, so I've got kind of a base laid down, and this is already looking really thick, but this is going to compress down. So I've got one layer of Polworth going lengthwise, and I've got some Targhee going the other way. So at this point, I'm going to start adding some of my color in here, and I'm going to keep crisscrossing a little bit. Now, I kind of want a little bit of color in here, but at this point, the color is just kind of where we're playing. So this looks like this has some Rambouillet and alpaca in it. So I'm actually going to treat this kind of like the braid, where I just stretch out the fiber a little bit and span it across. And from here, I'm going to go right in here. So we'll do one section there. And it's okay if it ends up a little thin because I've got this other little art bat on the other side. And some of this I will use for patching if I end up with a couple thin spots. But if I do any sort of patching, I'm going to want to do it on the other side because I don't want to be patching with fiber on the front side because then people will see, they'll see like it'll kind of break up the embellishment part of it. So any patching that I do is going to be on the other side. So this may be just a little on the long side, but that's okay. And then I'm probably just going to feather this into the other one a little bit so it's not such an obvious switch over. So now I've got a whole nother layer going the other way. So now when I add in, at this point I'm going to put my locks in so that I can get them sandwiched properly. So probably orientation wise I want to maybe alternate and get a little bit of gray and a little bit of white on each side. So with some of these fatter locks, I actually like to split these. You always split them from the tip. And then that gives me a little bit of a finer tassel, and it makes my locks go a little farther as well. So let's go grab a couple Lincoln locks. Now, as I integrate them, I want to make sure that there's enough of the fiber to hold on to, because these won't felt. Like, in the time that it takes all this other stuff to felt, these won't felt. So I will just spread apart the base of the lock, and I'm going to sandwich it right in between this other layer. And we'll have a whole nother layer on top, but you've got your stuff on the top and your stuff on the bottom, and you're just going to keep sandwiching everything right in the middle. So I'm just going to alternate. Here's some Lincoln locks. And for ease, let's just pull that apart. So I've got Cotswold. Here's some Lincoln. This will really, when you feather it like this, you'll still get a nice little tip, but it'll just really allow those other fibers to trap all that in. If you're going to put anything in here that doesn't felt, you want to make sure that it's trapped between stuff that will felt. So we'll talk about that a little bit with our embellishments as well. Such pretty colors. And I don't necessarily count the locks or anything. I kind of just gauge it by how full it looks. And I know like some people do like a ton of locks, but I just want enough to make it look like some tassels, because if you add too much, then the end of your scarf can look really bulky, and I don't necessarily like that as much. Okay, so that's one side, and we're just going to lay this back down, and we're going to spread that fiber right over the ends. And remember, we've got another layer that we can put on top of this, so I'll have a little bit more to sandwich these locks in. Okay, so I've got my locks on either side and they're all trapped in by another layer. So I'm going to go ahead and do my top layer. So I got this art bat from Tori. Sometimes she just sends me big boxes of goodies, so I'm not exempt from the spoiling that you guys get. So I've got some, looks like there's some Angelina and some yarn in here. And I like the little green splotches throughout. So I think I'm going to do the same thing as I did with that other layer of the bat. And I'm just going to spread it out and stick it right over the top. Because I want to kind of preserve the character of the bat a little bit. Because I like it a lot. So we'll just spread that. And I'm going to try and pull those all the way up to the edges so that those, there, I get my little decorative bits up at the edges, and it kind of helps trap in the locks a little bit more. So I don't know what kind of thread this is. So when you get to your embellishments and whatnot, if you're not sure if something will felt, you want to make sure that it's trapped underneath something that will felt. So I think I'm just going to take some of this and put it underneath some other bits so that I know that the ends will be trapped in. And you can kind of cobweb it over that stuff. And like stuff like silk. Silk is really fun, but it doesn't necessarily felt to the surface, which I found out the hard way. So I had to kind of cobweb some alpaca over the top of it. See, I'm not sure what we have in here. These look like silk noils, maybe? She puts a lot of fun stuff in her art beds, which makes me happy. And then again, same as before, I'm just going to feather some of this. Oh, looks like we found the Lincoln lock of the bat. I'm going to feather some of this into the other side so it doesn't look like such an obvious change. And I think let's just pull this little green strip up. Like, you have so much freedom with this stuff, you guys. You can place everything so super intentionally that it's like inch by inch. Now, things obviously will shift a little bit as it felts, but you do have a lot of control over how these will look in the end. And then let's just grab a little end here. So if I wanted to, I could just sit here and pull this bat apart the way I did the base and just rearrange everything. But again, I liked the character of the bat. Oh, we got some corn silk fiber in here. Sorry, it's all the little treasures. Now, I have some mohair thread. I'm not sure how I want to do this. I think let's just start laying it out and see what we get. I think the mohair should felt into it pretty well, but I guess we'll find out. And if it doesn't, I might just pull it off. But if we can get this really cool looking pattern on here, that would be really cool. And I think the best part about all this is you can just experiment. And like if you were using like a wool yarn or something, that would absolutely felt right into this. So you could feel free to try things. I'm not sure about this little Lincoln lock. I think there's enough stuff around it where it should be fine. I'm really curious to see how this works. Alright. Just break it there. And alright. So now, I'm going to try and move some of this stuff out of the way. This is the part where we have to try and be careful as we put our mesh over the top, because we don't want this stuff to shift too much. There we go. So now, this is going to take a little bit to get it all soaked down. I'm not going to really soak the ends where the locks are too much, but I do want to make sure that I get around all of the edges. Now, as you start, I kind of like to start around the edges, and what I'll do is I'll actually up the stream on my squirt bottle a little bit, and I will spray right into the sides. And kind of what that does is it makes the wool stick away from the edges a little bit, just so I'm not fighting to pull those edges in too much. I guess, I'm not sure if I want to do a clean edge on this one. I think I'll leave it more of a raw edge, but I do want to just pull those edges in a little bit, so that when everything flattens out, then I won't have too much of that base sticking out from underneath all this really pretty stuff. So let's see if you can see that from the other side. So I've got my mesh in here, and sometimes I'll just push this right in so that it's not overhanging my mesh. And that'll really just help keep everything a bit more organized. Okay, so I'm going to continue wetting this down, and then we will throw it in the dryer. I'll probably, again, start this one off with 10 minutes just so I can make sure that everything gets tacked down. I can see if there's any dry spots, so I can re-wet those and make sure that this releases from my fiber.